Between 1934 and 1938, Cleveland, Ohio became the hunting ground for one of America's most sadistic and mysterious serial killers. Known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run or the Cleveland Torso Murderer, this unknown predator dismembered at least 12 victims with surgical precision, leaving their mutilated remains scattered across the city's industrial wasteland. Despite one of the most intensive investigations in American history, led by legendary lawman Eliot Ness himself, the killer was never caught, and his identity remains one of criminology's greatest mysteries. The nightmare began on September 5, 1934, when a young man walking along the Lake Erie shore in Cleveland stumbled upon something that would haunt him forever. Partially buried in the sand was the lower half of a woman's torso, severed cleanly at the waist. The precision of the cut suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, perhaps a surgeon or butcher. The upper portion of the body was found the next day, washed up on a different section of beach. Her head and limbs were never recovered. The victim, later identified as an unidentified woman dubbed the Lady of the Lake, had been dead for several months before her body was dumped in the water. The coroner noted that the dismemberment had been performed with extraordinary skill, the cuts made at the joints with almost surgical precision. Most disturbing was the realization that she had been decapitated while still alive, her head removed in a single practiced stroke. For a year, the case went cold. Then, on September 23, 1935, two young boys playing in the Kingsbury Run area, a desolate gulch that cut through Cleveland's industrial section, made a discovery that would terrorize the city for years to come. Hidden in the tall grass were two male bodies, both completely decapitated and emasculated. Their genitals had been removed and were never found. Both heads had been severed with the same surgical precision seen in the first victim. What made this discovery particularly horrifying was the condition of the bodies. The killer hadn't simply murdered these men, he had tortured them extensively before death. Both bodies bore signs of prolonged torture, with burn marks, knife wounds, and evidence of systematic mutilation performed while they were still alive. The medical examiner determined that the men had been kept alive for days, possibly weeks, while the killer methodically dismembered them piece by piece. Over the next 3 years, body parts continued to appear throughout Cleveland, each discovery more grotesque than the last. The killer's pattern became clear and terrifying. He would abduct victims, primarily drifters and homeless people who wouldn't be immediately missed. He would then take them to an unknown location where he would torture them, often for extended periods, before finally killing them through decapitation. After death, he would systematically dismember the bodies with surgical precision, often draining them of blood first to avoid making a mess. The method of blood drainage particularly disturbed investigators. The bodies were completely exsanguinated, drained of every drop of blood through careful incisions. Where did he do this? How did he dispose of gallons of human blood without detection? These questions haunted the investigation. By 1936, Cleveland was in a state of panic. 7 more victims had been found, all dismembered in the same methodical way. The killer seemed to take pride in his work, often posing the body parts in public places where they would be easily discovered. In one case, he arranged a victim's torso on the front steps of a factory, positioned so that workers arriving for the morning shift would find it immediately. The victims showed a disturbing pattern. Most were marginalized members of society, people living on the fringes who could disappear without immediate notice. The killer was choosing victims carefully, people whose absence wouldn't trigger immediate police involvement. This suggested intelligence and planning that made him all the more dangerous. In 1938, Eliot Ness, the famous lawman who had brought down Al Capone, was serving as Cleveland's director of public safety. The torso murders became his obsession and his greatest failure. Despite deploying unprecedented resources, conducting thousands of interviews, and pursuing every lead with relentless determination, Ness never caught the killer. One suspect emerged who seemed promising: Dr. Francis Sweeney, a surgeon with a history of mental illness and a drinking problem. Sweeney had the medical knowledge to perform the precise dismemberments, and he lived near Kingsbury Run. Ness became convinced Sweeney was the killer and subjected him to intensive interrogation, including 2 polygraph tests that Sweeney allegedly failed, but there was never enough evidence for an arrest. Shortly after the interrogation, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric hospital, where he remained for the rest of his life.
Interestingly, after Sweeney's institutionalization, the Cleveland murders stopped. But were they really over, or had the killers simply moved elsewhere? Between 1939 and 1950, remarkably similar torso murders occurred in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The victims were dismembered with the same surgical precision, drained of blood, and disposed of in the same manner. The Pittsburgh murders remain unsolved. What made the Cleveland torso murders particularly horrifying wasn't just the brutality, but the cold calculation behind them. This wasn't a crime of passion or rage. This was methodical, planned, and executed with the precision of someone who enjoyed their work. The killer had somewhere private to work, sophisticated enough to allow for extended torture sessions, blood drainage, and careful dismemberment. He had the knowledge to perform these operations, suggesting medical or butchering training. And he had the discipline to never leave meaningful evidence, never make a mistake that would lead to his capture. The victims, whose identities were eventually established, painted a picture of the killer's hunting grounds. They were people from the margins, living in the hobo camps along Kingsbury Run during the Great Depression. The killer would lure them with promises of work, food, or shelter, then transport them to his killing location. Some investigators believed he posed as a medical professional, offering free health screenings or treatments to desperate people who had no access to regular health care. One of the chilling aspects of the case involves the actual dismemberment process. The medical examiner's reports described cuts that indicated not just knowledge, but extensive practice. This killer didn't learn his technique on his first victim. He had practiced, perhaps on animals first, perfecting his method before graduating to humans. The precision suggested someone who had performed these similar operations hundreds of times. The psychological profile developed by early criminal profilers suggested a man of above-average intelligence, likely middle-aged, with medical or anatomical knowledge. He would appear normal to neighbors and colleagues, possibly respected in his community. He would be patient, methodical, and completely without empathy. The torture wasn't about extracting information or punishing perceived wrongs. The torture was the point. He derived satisfaction from the act itself, from the control, from watching his victims suffer. Despite Eliot Ness's best efforts, including the controversial decision to raid and burn down the Kingsbury Run shantytown in an attempt to protect potential victims, the killer was never caught. The official body count stands at 12 confirmed victims, but many investigators believe the true number could be as high as 20 or more. Some victims may have been completely disposed of, their disappearances never connected to the torso murders. Today, the Cleveland torso murders remain one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American criminal history. Whoever the Mad Butcher was, he possessed a combination of intelligence, skill, and sadistic cruelty that allowed him to commit horrific crimes in sight of one of America's major cities while evading one of the country's most famous lawmen. He may have died taking his secrets with him, or he may have simply moved on to other hunting grounds, his crimes attributed to different killers in different cities. The case reminds us that evil can be intelligent, patient, and methodical. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who kill in rage or passion. They're the ones who kill with the calm precision of someone performing a routine task, who can torture a human being for days and then go home to lead an apparently normal life. Somewhere in Cleveland's history, such a person walked among the crowds, hiding behind a mask of normalcy while harboring the soul of a monster. And despite everything we know about criminal investigation, despite all our advances in forensic science, he got away with it. On December 15, 1900, a steamship called the Arctur was passing through the treacherous waters near the Flannan Isles, a cluster of remote, uninhabited islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. The captain noticed something deeply unsettling. The lighthouse on Eelimmoor Island was completely dark. No beam swept across the violent winter seas. No light guided ships away from the jagged rocks that had claimed countless vessels over the centuries. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Lighthouse keepers followed strict protocols. The light was never supposed to go out, never. The captain reported the darkness, but it would be 11 more days before anyone could investigate. The winter storms were too savage, the seas too violent. Finally, on December 26, 1900, Boxing Day, the relief vessel Hesperus arrived at Eelimmoor to deliver supplies and rotate the keepers. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, rowed to the landing platform. Everything was wrong from the moment he approached. The usual storage boxes for supplies were missing from the dock. No one came to greet him. The island was silent except for the screaming wind and crashing waves. Moore climbed the steep steps carved into the cliff face, 70 feet up to the lighthouse compound. His unease grew with each step. When he reached the gate, he found it closed, not unusual. But the main door to the lighthouse was also closed, but unlocked, swinging slightly in the wind. This was highly irregular. Keepers never left doors unlocked. Moore entered and called out. His voice echoed through the stone structure. No response. He climbed the spiral staircase to the kitchen and living quarters. The scene he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. The kitchen clock had stopped. A chair was overturned. The remains of a meal sat on the table, untouched and long cold. But most disturbing was what he found, or rather, didn't find. All 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace. The men were experienced, reliable professionals: James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper who was filling in. These weren't inexperienced sailors or men prone to panic. They knew the sea, knew the dangers, and knew their duties. Moore frantically searched every room, every corner of the lighthouse. Nothing. He ran outside, checking the outbuildings, the animal enclosures, anywhere the men might be. The island was less than 40 acres. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. Shaking, Moore returned to the landing and signaled frantically to the Hesperus. The captain and several crew members came ashore. Together, they conducted a thorough search. What they found only deepened the mystery. The lighthouse was in order. The lamps were filled with oil, cleaned, and ready to be lit. The last entry in the log was from December 15th, 11 days earlier. But here's where things became truly strange. The log entries from the days before told a disturbing story. December 12, Thomas Marshall wrote about severe winds, worse than anything he'd experienced in his 20 years at sea. He noted that James Ducat, the principal keeper, had been very quiet. Donald MacArthur, normally calm and stoic, had been crying. A hardened lighthouse keeper weeping for no apparent reason. December 13th, Marshall recorded that the storm was still raging. All 3 men had been praying. This was unusual. While the men were religious, such collective displays of fear were uncharacteristic of seasoned keepers. December 15th, the final entry simply stated that the storm had passed and the sea was calm. Then nothing. The log ended. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. According to official weather records, there had been no storm on those dates. December 12th and 13th had been calm and clear throughout the region.
Multiple ship's logs confirmed this. The weather didn't turn violent until December 17th, 2 days after the log's final entry and 2 days after the lighthouse went dark.
What storm had the men experienced? What had terrified them so deeply that one was reduced to tears and all three were praying desperately? The investigation revealed more disturbing details. 2 of the 3 sets of oilskin outerwear, heavy weatherproof coats the keepers wore outside, were missing, but the 3rd set remained hanging on its hook. This suggested 2 men had gone outside, while the 3rd had remained inside, or perhaps had rushed out without protection. Why would experienced keepers violate basic safety protocols? The regulations were clear. At least 1 keeper must remain inside at all times to tend the light. Never, under any circumstances, should all 3 keepers leave the lighthouse unmanned. The west landing platform, on the side of the island most exposed to the Atlantic, showed signs of tremendous damage. A massive iron railing had been ripped from its concrete moorings and bent. A rock platform more than 100 feet above sea level showed evidence of extreme wave damage. Equipment boxes weighing hundreds of pounds had been torn from their mountings and scattered. But remember, this damage couldn't have occurred on December 12-13 when the keepers reported the storm, because there was no storm then. This destruction happened on or after December 17, 2 days after the men had already vanished. Something happened on December 15, something that wasn't a storm, at least not a natural one. Theories immediately proliferated, each more unsettling than the last. Theory 1, a massive rogue wave. Perhaps the men saw something alarming from the lighthouse, a ship in distress or unusual wave activity. 2 went to investigate while the 3rd watched from inside. Then a massive rogue wave swept them into the sea. But this doesn't explain why the experienced principal keeper would allow this violation of protocols, or why the 3rd man would then vanish as well, leaving the door unlocked and the lighthouse unmanned. Theory 2, murder. Some suggested 1 keeper went mad and killed the others, then died by suicide in the sea. But there was no evidence of violence in the lighthouse. No blood, no signs of struggle. And the log entries showed all 3 men were equally distressed days before the disappearance, hardly consistent with 1 man suddenly snapping. Theory 3, accident chain. Perhaps 1 man fell or was swept into the sea while checking equipment. The 2nd rushed to help without grabbing his coat and was also lost. The 3rd then, what? Also rushed out and was killed? Why wouldn't he have sounded an alarm first or made a log entry? But none of these rational explanations satisfied the investigators, and they certainly didn't satisfy the locals, who knew the island's dark reputation. The Flannan Isles had been considered cursed for centuries. Ancient Celtic legends spoke of supernatural beings inhabiting the islands, the Seething Inn, fairy folk who lured men to their doom. Shepherds who had occasionally brought sheep to graze on Island Moor reported hearing strange cries and whispers when no one else was there. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures in the mist. The old stories told of phantom ships that appeared in the fog, crewed by skeletal figures, of voices calling from the cliffs, of men who landed on the islands and were never seen again. The local Gaelic name for the islands translated to the Islands of the Dead. Lighthouse keepers at other remote Scottish stations reported strange phenomena at Flannan Isles even before the 1900 tragedy. They spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread that would settle over them when looking toward those islands. Some reported seeing lights on Island Moor before the lighthouse was even built, mysterious illuminations with no source, appearing and disappearing. One particularly disturbing detail emerged during the investigation. A hymn book was found open in the living quarters, turned to a hymn about men lost at sea, their souls taken by the deep.
Had the men been reading this before they vanished? Or had something else opened it to that particular page? Captain Robert Muirhead, who led the official investigation, wrote in his report, "The circumstances of this disappearance are such that they give rise to the gravest suspicions of the 3 men having been washed away by a heavy sea." But even he admitted the evidence didn't fully support this conclusion. Superintendent Robert Muirhead added a chilling detail. The keepers' beds were unmade, suggesting whatever happened occurred suddenly, perhaps in the early morning. The kitchen fire had gone out, meaning the men had been gone for many hours before the relief keeper arrived. In the years that followed, other lighthouse keepers stationed at Flannan Isles reported disturbing experiences. They heard 3 sets of footsteps pacing the gallery at night when they were alone. They found doors they'd locked standing open. They felt watched. Several keepers requested immediate transfers, refusing to explain why. One keeper was found in a state of complete nervous collapse and had to be removed from service.
The poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson immortalized the mystery in his 1912 ballad Flannan Isle, which ends with a haunting lines about the relief keeper finding 3 men dead on the island, though in reality, no bodies were ever found. The poem captured the public imagination and cemented the incident as one of maritime history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Over the decades, more theories emerged. Foreign spies. Some suggested the men had witnessed a foreign vessel, perhaps German spies, in the build-up to WW1, and were murdered to protect the secret. But the timing was wrong. WW1 wouldn't begin for 14 years. Sea serpent or giant squid. A few proposed that a massive sea creature emerged from the depths and attacked the men. Scotland has a long history of sea serpent sightings, and the deep waters around the islands were largely unexplored. Supernatural abduction. The most disturbing theory, popular among locals, was that the men had been taken by something not of this world. The false storm in the log, the inexplicable terror, the complete disappearance, all pointed to something beyond natural explanation. Psychological break. Modern psychologists have suggested the isolation and stress caused a shared psychotic episode, causing the men to walk into the sea together in a suicide pact. But this doesn't explain the missing coats or the unlocked door. In 1971, the lighthouse was finally automated, and the last keepers left Flannan Isles. Today, the islands remain uninhabited. The lighthouse stands empty, maintained only by occasional technician visits. Few venture there. The islands are difficult to access, and the reputation lingers. But those who have visited in recent years report the same unsettling sensations. An oppressive atmosphere, the feeling of being watched. Some have photographed strange mists that appear only in certain spots. Others have recorded unexplained sounds, voices calling across empty water, footsteps on stone stairs when no one is there. The most chilling accounts come from sailors who've passed the islands at night. Even with GPS and modern navigation, many give the islands a wide berth. They report seeing lights in the lighthouse windows, impossible since the structure has been automated and empty for decades. Some claim to have seen 3 figures standing on the west landing, watching passing ships. When they look through binoculars, the figures vanish. The official cause of death for James Ducott, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur was listed as swept away by the sea. But no bodies were ever recovered. No personal effects washed ashore. It was as if the 3 men simply ceased to exist on December 15, 1900. What really happened on Island Moor? Did the men see something so terrifying it drove them into the sea? Did they witness something they weren't meant to see? Were they taken by forces beyond human understanding? The Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands as a monument to an unsolvable mystery. 3 experienced men vanished from a locked island, leaving behind a cold meal, a stopped clock, and a log that spoke of storms that never happened. The sea keeps its secrets, and the islands remain silent except for the wind and waves. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the seas grow violent, some sailors swear they can see the lighthouse burning bright, not with electric light, but with the warm glow of oil lamps that haven't been used in over a century. And if you listen carefully over the wind, you might hear 3 men's voices calling out across the water, trying desperately to tell their story to anyone who will listen. The truth died with James Ducott, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur on that cold December day in 1900. And perhaps some truths are meant to stay buried in the depths, never to surface, never to be fully understood. A reminder that even in our modern world, there are still places where the old darkness lingers, and mysteries that refuse to be solved.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out, so subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.